Alrighty, so this week we're going to be in Genesis 38 and 39. So if you've got your Bibles, you can go ahead and turn to Genesis 38 and 39. This week has some difficult stories in it, but it also has some of the most amazing storytelling in the Bible. I really appreciate, especially when we get to chapter 39, just the ways that Moses is, as he's writing this Joseph narrative, he's making connections, he's using imagery, he's using all this really impressive writing technique that is just making this beautiful story. And I think you especially see it in chapter 39. So I'm excited to get to chapter 39. But before we get to chapter 39, we do go through chapter 38, which I think is important to the Joseph narrative. Just a recap of what we talked about last week. I gave a big kind of overview of where the book of Genesis is going and kind of these questions that the book of Genesis is trying to answer, that is all kind of climaxing in this conclusion of the Joseph narrative. And we saw that this is a story about the seed of Abraham, or the seed of Adam, that is going to come and bruise the head of the serpent, and then ultimately that goes to the seed of Abraham, and we're tracing this sort of royal descendant that is supposed to come from these people. And it's going to be a royal descendant that has come to bless the nations. We see tension come into the story as there's fraternal strife and between brothers. We see tension as famine comes and threatens the descendants of the woman. We see Joseph has these dreams with this kind of royal idea that his brothers would bow down to him and that he would reign over his brothers. And his brothers don't like that, so they sell him into slavery. They act out of jealousy. But we start to see the sovereignty of God at work even in that. Even with the wickedness of Joseph's brothers, and even as they are acting in a way that is clearly not pleasing to the Lord, God is still working his plan in that. And I didn't really get to some of the application of that last week as we just mentioned what he says in chapter 45, and we'll get to that even more. But I do want to point out a couple things just in particular about how God's sovereignty works, how we should view God's sovereignty in the midst of suffering based on what happened to Joseph there in chapter 37. Joseph's brothers have sold him into slavery. He's lost everything, and yet in chapter 45 he said, God did this so that he could preserve life through me. It was God who sent me down to Egypt. So the big picture of that I think we should remember and apply to our lives is God is doing something good. God is always doing something good. No matter what is happening in our lives, whether it's a time of blessing or a time of suffering, God is always doing something good. And you see in the story a few things. You see God's doing something good when life is unfair. Things were not fair, the fact that Joseph was sold into slavery. But also, you look earlier in the narrative, things were not fair for the other brothers as their father was doting on Joseph and showing favoritism to Joseph. Yet in all of that, God was doing something good. Whether Joseph was being favored or whether Joseph was being unfairly treated negatively, God was doing something good. God is also doing something good through sinful people. We all experience sinful people in our lives sinning towards us, and we experience ourselves being sinners and struggling with sin of our own. And yet, we see through Joseph's brothers, God is doing something good even through those sinful people. God is doing something good through sinful people, and we can find a lot of hope in that. We can find a lot of hope when we are failing and when we are struggling, that still we are not ruining God's big plan for history in our failures. God is still doing something good. And when people are acting sinfully towards us and hurting us and harming us, and it is a difficult thing, we can find hope in the fact that even through all of that, God is still doing something good. And connected to that, God is doing something good through your suffering. Whatever suffering you may be going through, it is not outside of God's will, where He is working all things together for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. God is always doing something good. So don't lose hope. God is doing something good. And we see that train of God's sovereignty go throughout the Joseph narrative. And we see it even in chapter 38, where we are introduced to Judah's immorality. Now, what happened at the end of chapter 37 is Joseph's brothers took his clothes after they had sold him. They killed a goat or an animal, and they dipped the clothing in an animal's blood, and they took it home to their father and said, "Look, he's been mauled by an animal, and he's dead." So they've deceived their father with this clothing of Joseph that's covered in blood, and Jacob believes that Joseph is now dead. And Joseph is taken down into Egypt by the people that his brothers sold him to. Now, chapter 38, if you just kind of read through and you think of this as the Joseph narrative, 38 seems really out of place. In fact, one of the commentators that I read on this, that I really like this commentator, but he says that all commentators agree that chapter 38 clearly interrupts the flow of the Joseph story. I read another commentary that disagreed with him, so I think he's he's actually wrong. But he suggests that this chapter is just kind of put in here because it's an important chapter and there's really no better place for it, but it doesn't really fit in the Joseph narrative. I don't think that's the case. I think it really does fit in this narrative, because remember what I said last week, this isn't just the Joseph narrative. This is the sons of Jacob narrative. This is a story about the descendants of Jacob and the sons of Jacob, particularly Joseph and Judah. So if we follow this storyline of Joseph and Judah, here now it kind of focuses in on Judah. Judah, the one who just betrayed his brother and suggested that they sell him into slavery. This is Judah, who's already shown himself to not be the highest character guy. His character is going to dive even deeper. So as we remember that when they wrote, when Moses wrote this, there weren't chapter divisions. So 37, 38, 39, it's all just one story. It all runs together. And so I think where he inserts this story about Judah, he is continuing this story of the Judah who just sold Joseph into slavery, and then that's going to transition smoothly into what happens to Joseph when he goes down to Egypt. So let's read in Genesis chapter 38. I will tell you, there are a few verses today I am not going to read, because there are some words in some of these verses that I just don't want to say. But we'll talk about them. There's some uncomfortable storytelling here, but it really ties us back into the story of Genesis. So we're going to start reading in verse 1 and follow along with me. It says, "It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Judah was in Chezib whenever she bore him." I have no idea if I said any of those words right, but it doesn't matter. It's okay. This moves the story of Joseph to another section where it says it happened at that time, but it also connects it. This is after they have sold Joseph into slavery. So after that, Judah goes and he takes a Canaanite wife. And from the start, Judah's marriage is viewed negatively by the text. Now, at this point, they don't have a law against marrying Canaanites. They will later on in whenever they are delivered up out of Egypt, there is a law against them intermarrying with the Canaanites. But right now, it's not technically a law. But if you look throughout Genesis, you have Abraham did not want Isaac to marry a Canaanite, and he was insistent that Isaac should not marry a Canaanite. And then the same thing happens with Isaac about Jacob, saying Jacob needs to not marry one of these Canaanite women. And then Esau, Jacob's brother, does marry a Canaanite woman, and it says that she made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. So already in Genesis, there's this negative viewing of the people of God intermarrying with the pagans of the world. So this isn't a interracial issue where they shouldn't be marrying between races. This is them saying you are marrying pagans who are going to draw your worship away from the true and living God. So there's definitely a negative light on Judah based just on on the woman that he's marrying. But he has 3 sons. And those sons' names all have interesting meanings to them. But what happens next, it says Judah took a wife for his firstborn. So this is a pretty long time, right? This is describing a long time. He's had 3 children, and they've grown to the point where they are being given in marriage. So think about Joseph at this point. Joseph has gone down into Egypt, and his brother is having grandchildren now. Like this is a long time that Joseph is spending in Egypt. Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Now, this is really interesting. This is the first time in the whole Bible that God kills an individual person. That it says God looked at this one person and found that he was wicked enough that God would simply kill that individual. You see judgment over lots of people with the flood and that sort of thing. But this one, God looked at his wickedness and said, he needs to die. It doesn't tell us what his wickedness was, but it says he was wicked and he needed to die. So verse 8, Judah said to Onan, his secondborn, go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother. So what's happening here is what's called levirate marriage. The idea was that if a firstborn son died, his brother would have the responsibility of extending his name, extending his descendants. And remember, the concern that we've had throughout Genesis is the extending of the descendant of a particular group of people. So Judah here seems to be saying, all right, we need to extend the descendants, right? We need to produce the seed that is going to continue. And so he goes to the younger brother. So purposes of levirate marriage, first of all, is to extend the offspring of the deceased. But the second part of it was to support the widow. Remember, there's not governmental assistance for widows. There's not kind of built-in social structures that are going to help widows. This is a way for them to care for people in need. A woman who is a widow would have no way to support herself now. And so she would go to the younger brother to support him. And later on in laws that you see later in the Bible about this, it was an extreme shame on that younger brother if he decided not to do this. In fact, if she went to him to be taken in levirate marriage and he said no, she had the right to take off his sandal and spit in his face. Like that was the rule. Like if this doesn't happen, take off the sandal, spit in his face, and there is shame on this man. So Judah goes to Onan and he says, you need to do levirate marriage. You need to fulfill the obligations here. Extend the offspring. Take care of this widow. I'm not going to read the next part, but Onan doesn't want to do this. So he finds a way to avoid doing this. And you're welcome to read that later. I just don't want to say it out loud because it's gross. But he is specifically deciding not to extend the descendant of this woman. And it displeases the Lord. So it says in verse 10, what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up, for he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. So, Onan receives the same judgment, and the idea would be that it would go on to the next son, but presumably is too young at this point. But Judah has a different reason for not giving him to her, and we're going to see that later, that it wasn't just this guy's too young. He thinks that is going to die too now, and he doesn't want to lose his other son, so he's refusing now to give, or Shelah, sorry, that's the youngest one. He's refusing to give Shelah to Tamar because he's afraid that he would suffer the same fate as his brothers. Now, in verse 12, it says, "In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. Then Judah was comforted. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. And when Tamar was told, 'Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep,' she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage." So, it's not just that Shelah was too young. Shelah's grown now, and Judah is still not interested in giving him to her in marriage. Judah really here is doing the same thing as Onan was doing. He's really making it impossible for the descendant of to be had through Tamar here. And so he's sinning against the Lord in doing this. Verse 15, "When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face, and he turned to her at the roadside and said, 'Come, let me come in to you,' for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, 'What will you give me that you may come in to me?' And he answered, 'I will give you a young goat from the flock.' And she said, 'If you give me a pledge until you send it.' He said, 'What pledge shall I give you?' And she replied, 'Your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand.' So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood." So, Judah, we see his immorality here, and it's really important for us to notice Judah's immorality because this is going to contrast very, very starkly to what we see from Joseph in the next chapter, in chapter 38. It's also going to contrast from what we see in Judah towards the end of this story in the Joseph narrative. So it's very important for us to see where Judah's heart is here. He is extremely immoral here. Verse 20, "When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, 'Where is the cult prostitute that was at Enaim at the roadside?' And they said, 'No cult prostitute has been here.' So he returned to Judah and said, 'I've not found her.' Also the men of the place said, 'No cult prostitute has been here.' And Judah replied, 'Let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her.'" Now here what we're going to start to see is connections with chapter 37 of deception. How people are being deceived. And it's going to show Judah now reaping what he has sown. Back with Jacob, if you know anything about the life of Jacob, Jacob spent most of his life deceiving. He deceived and he deceived and he deceived. And then you see in chapter 37, his sons deceive him. They come to him and they deceive him about Joseph's fate. But now here what we're going to see is Judah is going to be deceived, just like he deceived Jacob and just like Jacob had deceived throughout his life. The first way we see that is Judah is deceived with clothing. Remember, he deceived his father with his brother's clothing being dipped in a goat's blood. He's deceiving him about the life of his brother. And here, Judah is deceived by the clothing of his daughter-in-law. He doesn't know that she is his daughter-in-law because she's worn a veil. She's changed out of her widow's garments. She's changed into these other garments that make it seem that she's a prostitute. He's being deceived with the clothing, much like he just deceived his father. And also, he is deceived with the price of a goat, which sounds kind of weird, but the price that he agrees to with Tamar is a goat, just like the goat that was slaughtered for Joseph, for them to deceive their father. And so here he is, for the same price, being deceived by Tamar. And then finally, the deception is concluded with identification. Let me read the next thing to explain that. Verse 24, it says, "About 3 months later, Judah was told, 'Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality.' And Judah said, 'Bring her out and let her be burned.' As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, 'By the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant.' And she said, 'Please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff.' Then Judah identified them and said, 'She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah.' And he did not know her again." Now, if you look at these words here, where Tamar comes and says, "Identify whose these are," that is the exact same phrase that is said in chapter 37 when they bring Joseph's cloak to Jacob and say, "Identify these. Whose are these things? Are these your son's things?" And so you have this connection here where they are deceiving Jacob with this, "Please identify," and Tamar, who has deceived him, is now saying, "Please identify these things." And so now Judah is reaping what he has sown. But even in all of this, remember, we are tracing this theme of God being sovereign and God working through all of these things. And God is still working in all of this. Judah rushes to condemn her, even though he is just as guilty as she is. He wants her to be burned immediately. But then Judah's demeanor changes when he's confronted with his sin. And he actually does something that seems close to repenting. He says that she's more righteous than he is. He doesn't end up paying any penalty for the sin that he has committed, but his demeanor changes and he acknowledges his fault. And I think this is the start of a major positive transformation of Judah that we're going to see at the end of the Joseph narrative. And I think part of the reason that Moses thought he needs to put this in here at this point was to see kind of the spark of that change in the character of Judah to be a very different person at the end of the Joseph narrative. But what comes out of this is in verse 27, "When the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb. And when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, 'This one came out first.' But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out. And she said, 'What a breach you have made for yourself.' Therefore his name was called Perez. Afterward his brother came out with a scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah." So you have the birth of these twins. Zerah, the firstborn, he was supposed to be the firstborn, but remember this theme where the younger brother seems to be taking precedence all throughout Genesis. You have the younger brother Isaac takes precedence. The younger brother Jacob takes precedence. Joseph is the younger brother. Here again, Zerah I don't know how this works. I have seen childbirth twice now. I don't know how it works, but somehow Zerah is supposed to be the firstborn, but then Perez comes out behind him. So the significance of Perez, this child, cannot be understated. Perez is a hugely significant person because we later learn that Perez is the ancestor of a guy named Boaz. If you read in the book of Ruth, it gives a genealogy that comes down to Boaz, who then with Ruth has a child that it is traced down to King David. So from Judah to Perez, you have this line that is going to go down to David. And ultimately, in Matthew chapter 1, we see that line comes down to Jesus. So it is through the line of Perez, through this crazy immorality, this struggle of levirate marriage and Judah doing something he never should have done. Through all of that, God is working to somehow bring about his purpose of saving his people. God is sovereignly working even through all of this. And if you notice in Matthew chapter 1, this is kind of a pattern of how God works. You see 4 different women mentioned in the genealogy in Matthew chapter 1. And the thing that they all have in common is these aren't women that you would necessarily expect to be in a genealogy. You have Tamar, who pretended to be a prostitute and was impregnated by her father-in-law. You have Rahab, who was a prostitute, who ended up converting. You have Bathsheba, who we all know the story of David and Bathsheba and the immorality that was there. And you have Ruth, who has great character in the Bible, but she's a Moabite. She's a foreigner. She's not supposed to be part of the people of Israel. And yet, through each of these women, God is moving his plan towards bringing the Messiah. And that's exactly what you see here. No matter how messy all of it seems, God is using seemingly godless situations to bring about his good purposes. So, we can really find hope in that. Again, like I said before, don't lose hope because God is doing something good, even whenever the situations in your life seem godless and hopeless. Now, before we move to chapter 39, does anyone have any questions about any of that story? All right, let's look at chapter 39. So, notice in all of chapter 38, the only time God is mentioned is in the context of judgment. The only time you see God anywhere in chapter 38 is he's killing these people because of their wickedness. That's going to be strongly contrasted in chapter 39, where in verse 1 we see that the Lord was with Joseph. And from the very start here, we're going to see that Joseph's life is moved forward simply by this fact that the Lord was with Joseph. And I want to make this chapter really practical for you all and just help you to recognize through the story of Joseph here that you can honor God with your life in every circumstance if the Lord is with you. No matter what the circumstance is, no matter what challenges you run into, no matter what suffering or sin is coming against you, you can honor God with your life if the Lord is with you. I want us to see that in the life of Joseph. Let's look in chapter 39, verse 1. It says, Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had brought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. And he made him the overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food that he ate. So, Joseph finds himself as a young Hebrew slave on the market in Egypt. He is far away from home. He's far away from anyone he's ever known. He's far away from his father, who has always doted on him and always cared for him. Joseph finds himself in Egypt seemingly completely alone. But whenever he's alone and his circumstances seem completely hopeless, verse 2 gives us that hopeful saying that the Lord was with him. And I want to point out, there are not many times in the Joseph narrative that God is referred to by his proper name. And if you see in your Bible that it says Lord in all caps there, that is the proper name of God. That's his name, Yahweh. That is the way that he reveals himself to Moses in the book of Exodus. And through most of the Joseph narrative, you see God referred to as God. There's only a couple places where he's referred to as the Lord, as Yahweh, that he is this personal relating God who someone can actually know. And most of the places that he is mentioned like that are here in chapter 39. The only other place you really see it is in 49, and it's talking more about Jacob than it's talking about Joseph. So this is significant that this is God's personal name being used as being with Joseph. And whenever it says God is with Joseph, it's not just saying he was standing there with him. Like, it's not just he was present with him. If you see in the Old Testament particularly that the Lord is with someone, it means the Lord is working on their behalf. The Lord is they are in the favor of the Lord. God is helping them and pushing them towards victory and blessing. The Lord was for Joseph, is very much what this is saying. So remember, in the bigger narrative, God is working this sovereign plan through the life of Joseph to preserve the lives of his people. And so he is with Joseph here to use his life for his purposes. And that is something that should transform the way that we look at our lives. If we recognize the fact that God is with us working a sovereign plan through us, that God is doing something good through your life, that should transform how you look at all of your circumstances, no matter what those circumstances are. If the Lord is with us and is working a sovereign plan through us, we should first of all be humble in times of blessing. God transforms Joseph's circumstances here at the beginning. He goes from being a 17-year-old laying naked in a pit with his brothers eating his lunchbox, he has absolutely no hope. He has nothing. And then God just supernaturally transforms his circumstances here and places him in a position of blessing. And he comes to this place that's described as the house of his Egyptian master. And the house of his Egyptian master is, at this point, a place of blessing in Joseph's life. You see God blessing him in 4 ways here. You see in verses 2 and 3 that he was given success. Everything he touched was successful. Everything that Potter gave over to him flourished. God blessed him and gave him success. The second thing is he gained favor in his master's eyes. So his master saw, and it says that Potiphar recognized the Lord was with Joseph. He saw God is doing something with this guy, and I want to put him in charge of more things. He got favor in his master's eyes, and so he got responsibility. It says it repeats. Anytime you see in the Bible something just repeated over and over again, it's making a point. And notice in verses 4 to 6, it says at the end of 4, he put him in charge of all that he had. From the time he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge. And so it's emphasizing this fact that Potiphar is giving him everything. Joseph has all of it, and he has responsibility over all of it. That's going to come into play in the next part. But the final thing that we see that the blessing that God gives Joseph is he receives trust in his master's eyes. His master is willing to leave him with all of his things alone while his master goes and does his thing. The only thing it says that he doesn't give him authority over is the food that he ate. And there's some discussion about what exactly that means. Some people think that's just kind of generally saying the personal affairs of Potiphar. Some people think that's a euphemism talking about his wife. That the food that he ate was actually, this one thing was his wife, like we're going to see later in the story. Some people think it's just his food. Like, that could be the most natural way to read it, is for some reason he didn't let Joseph touch his food. That might have been because Joseph was a Hebrew, and the Hebrew wouldn't know how to handle the food like an Egyptian would know how to handle the food, so they would have someone else handle that. Whatever the case, Joseph basically has charge over everything that Potiphar has. So what did Joseph contribute to get all of this? I mean, according to the text, not a whole lot. Like, it doesn't say that Joseph was this incredible guy that did all these amazing things to gain all this trust. What does it say? The Lord was with Joseph. That's what makes the difference, was that the Lord was with him, and the Lord saw fit to bless him abundantly in this time. if you notice the language of blessing here, that should ring a bell when you think about the big picture narrative of Genesis. What does God come to Abraham and promise him? He promises him blessing, and not just blessing, he promises that his offspring is going to be a blessing to the nations, and he promises that God will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And here I think we see God doing that. God is blessing those who bless the offspring of Abraham. And in turn, the offspring of Abraham is now being a blessing to the nations. He is being a blessing to this foreign Egyptian official. So in this we see just a little introduction to Joseph being a fulfillment of the promise of Abraham, that all the families of the world will be blessed in him. Now, recognize that in this time of blessing, we have to recognize, even in our own times of blessing, that success and favor and trust and responsibility, when these things come into our lives, we ought to be humble in receiving those things, recognizing they only come from the favor of God on our lives. They only come from the fact that the Lord has been with us. If we don't humble ourselves before the Lord in times of blessing, when our circumstances change, that can cause some serious problems. And Joseph's circumstances change here. He's in this incredible time of blessing, but then everything starts to crumble down. He's in the house of his Egyptian master. But then in verse 7, end of verse 6, it says, Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Interesting thing to throw in there. Verse 7, after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me, except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. So, he's here in the house of his Egyptian master, this place of blessing, and he's living the benefits of God's blessing when temptation comes along. And it comes in the form of a quick and blunt temptation. These are 2 words in the Hebrew, 3 in English. Lie with me. That's it. That's all it says that she says. And this is a woman with power and some authority in this house, surely. And she comes to Joseph with this temptation. And as abrupt and indiscreet as that temptation sounds, that is a temptation that has ensnared so many people over the years. And it continues to ensnare people who are in positions like Joseph. People who have found success, people who have been given responsibility, people that are trusted with many things in this life, and then this temptation of Potiphar's wife comes along and gives the opportunity to wreck all of it. And it would miss the point of the text to say that it's all about the resisting of temptation and the danger of sexual temptation. But I do think it's important for us to recognize here that temptation of Potiphar's wife comes for just about everyone in this life. Even if it doesn't sound quite that blunt and indiscreet, that temptation comes, and that is a temptation that can tear down everything that has been, all the blessing that has been built up in your life. If you look in Proverbs all throughout the Bible, it speaks against sexual immorality as sexual immorality being against the law of God. And it is that. You also see in Proverbs, it's less about it being against the law of God, and it's more about it just being dumb, that it just ruins your life. And that falling into sexual immorality will cause you to walk down a path where you lose everything. And I think as we read the story of Joseph, that is an opportunity for Joseph to take. But in that, he is risking, if he was to submit to this temptation, he would be risking all of the blessing that God has given him. What is interesting here is as he resists the temptation, he still has to risk that blessing. And so he is choosing here not between blessing and resisting temptation, and losing blessing and not resisting temptation. He is choosing here basically between two losses. He's going to either lose the favor of God and not have the Lord with him, or he's going to lose the favor of the Egyptians. And that's exactly what ends up happening here. But we see this wrecking people's lives. In particular, people in positions of power. You see it if you look around at men who are in ministries that are flourishing. Pastors are pastors of churches that are growing and they have all of this trust of the people, and then you see them fail. And what is it that makes them fail? It's just this simple temptation of Potiphar's wife. For some reason, it is so powerful against people who are living in times of blessing. But Joseph remembers that the Lord was with him. And I think that is huge here. He remains humble in his time of blessing, because look at what he says. He says, I can't do this because of all the ways that I have been blessed. And in the end of verse 9, it says, how can I then do this great wickedness and sin against God? He's not just saying I can't sin against Potiphar. He's saying I can't sin against God. And I think he's recognizing here, the only reason I have success and responsibility and favor in my master's eyes is because God has been with me. That's the only reason that he has any of this. And he says, I would be sinning against God if this one thing that had been kept from me I would take. And that really calls back an image of the Garden of Eden, doesn't it? Where God created Adam and Eve and he placed them in this garden. And he said, you can have all the trees of the garden. You can eat from any of it. Enjoy. Take all of it. Everything I have, it's yours. Except for this one thing. Don't take from this one tree. And Joseph here has all that he could have in the house of Potiphar, but there's this one thing that has been withheld from him. Now, we talk about Joseph being this conclusion to Genesis, where Adam and Eve failed. You see Joseph here succeed. Where Adam and Eve took of that one thing and they decided they wanted to usurp God's authority. They wanted to take the one thing that had been forbidden. Here, Joseph humbles himself in the eyes of the Lord, and he refuses to take the one thing that had been denied to him. So, Joseph, instead of exalting himself, he lives humbly in the blessing of God. Now, what happens next, it says, one day when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were there in his house, verse 12, she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. I love this story in terms of talking to students about resisting temptation, because this guy literally, there is a woman grabbing at him, tempting him, and he says, nope, I would rather run out of this house naked if that is what it takes for me to resist the temptation that is coming against me. And I think it's a beautiful picture of being willing to do whatever it takes to flee, not just kind of get a little bit away from temptation, but to flee temptation and to run from anything that would try and tempt us to not humble ourselves under the blessing of God. This is Joseph saying, I am going to be willing to humiliate myself and run out of here naked if it means I am not going to sin against God. He finds himself here alone seemingly with Potiphar's wife, but he remembers the Lord is with him. And knowing that the Lord is with us should lead us to be honest in times of temptation. So not only do we recognize God's presence in times of blessing, but in times of temptation. Now Joseph's garment is taken from him. And remember what I said in the first week in chapter 37, pay attention to Joseph's clothing. When he receives the cloak from his father, he's in this position of favor and of blessing, and then it's ripped away from him by his brothers. And now it seems that he's back in this place of blessing, and once again his garment is ripped away from him. And along with his garment, he loses everything here. He loses his status, he loses his career. It costs him literally everything, because what she does in verse 13, as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house." And then she waits for Potiphar to come home, and she gives him the same story. And what it says, verse 19, as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in prison. So, once again here, Joseph's garment is ripped from him, putting him in a compromising position. And once again, the garment is presented as evidence against Joseph. The garment is presented by Potiphar's wife as the evidence, saying Joseph basically is a dead man here. Joseph should have probably been punished by death if this was a legitimate crime. For some reason, Potiphar just throws him in prison. Some people think it's because Potiphar suspected his wife probably wasn't telling the truth. I think the sovereignty of God allowed Joseph to not be put to death for this, but put in prison. But either way, I think there's something to learn from this, that you are going to have to decide to run away even whenever it costs you everything. And there are going to be times when temptation comes in our lives, and it could cost you everything to say no. And you still have to say no. You still have to flee away from temptation. He didn't just leave his garment in Potiphar's house, but he left his dignity and he left his career. Seemingly, he left everything. But he didn't leave everything, because in verse 21 it says, "The Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed." Now, this is interesting. Joseph is sent... We talked about the house of the Egyptian master. And here it says he was sent to the prison. But in the original Hebrew, house is part of that word. It's the house of the prison is what it said. So it's contrasting here these two situations. He's in the house of his Egyptian master, this house of blessing, and now he's cast into the house of the prison. He's cast into this place that's supposed to be a pit, that's supposed to be the darkest of places, where surely the presence of God could not be there, and yet the Lord was with him. And so because of that, the sovereignty of God and recognizing that the Lord is with us should allow us to be hopeful in times of trouble. In the house of the prison, Joseph receives parallel blessings to the house of his Egyptian master. So remember, the Lord was with him in the house of his Egyptian master. He had success. He found favor in the master's eyes. He was given responsibility, and his master grew to trust him. Look at the things that happen in the prison. The Lord was with Joseph. He gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. The keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners. He's given responsibility. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything in his charge. He trusted him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. You see, all of the things that were true of him in the house of his Egyptian master are now true of him here in the house of the prison. Whatever the circumstance is, what matters is the Lord was with Joseph. You could be the richest, most powerful person in the world, or the poorest person with nothing who is the most oppressed and in the worst situation. But the biggest question is not, what is my circumstance? The biggest question is is the Lord with me? Is the Lord for me here? Because you can honor God with your life in every circumstance if the Lord is with you. The house of the prison was not too dark for God's presence to find Jesus. And there is no place on this earth and no circumstance on this earth that is too dark for the presence of God to be with us. Praise God, He has made a way that we can be certain that the Lord is with us. Because we read later in the Bible, because of Jesus, I can know the Lord is with me. Because like Joseph, Jesus was falsely accused. Like Joseph, his clothing was ripped from his body. Like Joseph, he was beaten and punished for sins that he never committed. He hung on a cross to pay for the sins that separated us from God, so that if we put our faith in Him, we can receive what He promised to His disciples in Matthew 28, when He says, "Go and make disciples of all nations, and look, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." And we can receive the promise that's in Hebrews 13:5 that says, "I will never leave you or forsake you." So we can confidently say, "The Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? What can circumstances do to me? What can a prison or blessing or temptation or any of these things do to me? The Lord is with me. The Lord is my helper." So we can look to the cross in whatever circumstance and know that the Lord is with us. He will never leave us. He will never forsake us. So we can live humbly in times of blessing, and we can live honestly in times of temptation. We can live hopefully in times of trouble, honoring Him in every circumstance because we know that the Lord is with us. I think that this section of the Joseph narrative is one of my favorite parts of Scripture, just because you see the Lord so beautifully present. But the Lord with Joseph here doesn't even compare with how the Lord is with us as believers today. That we have the Holy Spirit of God dwelling with us, walking with us, and we have the promise of God that that will be true always until we stand before His throne and live forever with Him in glory. That is a blessing that should be able to give us hope in whatever circumstance we have in this life.